Alright, today we are going to explain some of the weird things that we can see in War Thunder that are often left unexplained and for us to find out. And to start off, we have multipath. At no point in the game it is explained what is it, how does it work, or what is it used for. So I will show you examples of what is it, how it works, how to use it, and why is it useful. So here I have an F-15 flying low to the ground, and I will use radar missiles to try to take him down. But as you already know from experience, or maybe not, the missiles, for some reason, will hit below the target. Look. It does not hit the F-15, it just goes below. Even though it's clearly visible, the lock is clearly there. Well, now he's flying too high, but clearly visible, clearly there, clearly have a lock, and yet it does not hit the target. What is going on? And it is especially weird, since if you grinded through the tech trees to get to ITR aircraft, you know that at one point you couldn't lock onto anything that was low to the ground. Then there was the invention of pulse Doppler that made it possible to lock onto targets that are near the ground. But now, even with pulse Doppler that was made to lock onto aircraft flying low to the ground, it still doesn't work. What is going on? Well, actually, the answer is pretty simple. Under normal conditions, the radar sends a signal which bounces back from the target and back towards the radar. However, when the signal hits the target, it actually bounces back in an infinite amount of directions. And from all of those directions, there is multiple paths being created from which the signal can go back towards the radar. And one of those paths is the signal hits the target, bounces back towards the ground first, and it is then that the signal bounces back towards the radar. And this is how you get a multipath interference. The full name is multipath interference. It is basically an interference between what the radar sees and what is actually happening. And just to make things clear, it only happens when the target flies at low altitude because the reflected signal is very strong. So it's very hard from the point of view of the radar to differentiate between the actual target and the ghost target, since they look very similar. When the target is at higher altitude, multipath interference still happens. It is just that there is a lot fewer reflected signals, so the ghost target is a lot more faint. So it is very easy from the point of view of the radar to differentiate between the two. The ghost target is being filtered out and the lock only happens on the actual target. Alright, next up is afterburner color. So if you don't know, there is this one Russian aircraft engine that makes a blue color when the afterburner is activated. As you can see, it looks very odd compared to the other kind of afterburner that we have in game. Usually more like orange or yellow or sometimes purple, aka the tornado. So I tried to look it up and nowhere could I find a definitive answer onto why it is blue like this. So dumb as I am, I thought first of all it could be just because of the temperature, you know. The hotter something is, the bluer it gets, the more blue it gets. But this is completely false, because if it was blue because of the heat, it would be around 5000 degrees, which would entirely melt the engine. So it is not because of the flame temperature. Then I thought it could be because of a chemical that is in the fuel, which is called TEB, which stands for this word. Try to look it up. No, it can't really be this as well. First of all, the only plane that also used TEB was the SR-71, and it was only used to start up the afterburner. Afterwards, when the afterburner was ignited, it was not in use. It was kind of used like a lighter, well, as a lighter actually. So it can be because of TEB, and also because TEB produce a green flame. So after more digging, I found out that any flame using a normal, quote-unquote normal combustion, using fuel and oxygen, produces already a blue color in the flame. This blue color is the result of excited radicals inside the molecules that are being heated up. And these radicals, when they are excited, emit a blue color. So any flames produce a blue color. However, when the combustion isn't complete, this is what they call it, a complete combustion. When the combustion is not complete, the flame is orange or yellow. And this yellow and orange color completely overpowers the blue color that is originally in the flame. So in order to get the blue flame and only the blue flame, you need to have a complete combustion. To have a complete combustion, you basically, from what I've read, you basically just need the fuel and the oxygen to be very, very well mixed before being lit up on fire. When you have this condition ticked, there is complete combustion, there is no yellow and orange flame, and only the blue colors appear. It's exactly the same as if you have a gas stove. If you lit up your gas stove on fire, you will see the flames are blue. This is not because the flame is 8000 degrees or because there is some weird chemical in the flame. It is just because there is a complete combustion, which is needed. You know, you don't want a quote-unquote dirty combustion inside your house. So, something else you might have noticed or wondered upon is the flight model of the F-14 at high speed. So once you go above Mach 1, you will see something a bit weird happen. Yeah, you can see it very well. On the front of the aircraft there is actually two winglets that pop out, kind of out of nowhere, and they retract once you go slower. These were made to actually help with supersonic stability for the F-14, and specifically with the F-14A, because if you are careful, you will have noticed that on the F-14B, the winglets actually disappear. They are no longer present, and these winglets are actually called glove vans. Glove van. I don't really know the pronunciation, doesn't matter. And they were used for, as I said, supersonic flight and supersonic flight stability, because the aircraft had a tendency to point the nose a bit downwards once at supersonic speed. So these winglets provided more lift to pull the nose up, basically. So they had a function, they were functional and they were useful, but they weren't that useful because, first of all, supersonic flight wasn't that common to be used, and because they were also very complicated to use and maintain. They were basically, you know what, just remove them and we won't have to deal with them anymore, which will be a big bonus. So they removed them, and you can actually see it in game in the form of the F-14A having them and the F-14B not having them. In the end, the F-14B and F-14A are pretty different in terms of flight performance. Very different engine, very different flight characteristics and use cases. The F-14A is a lot faster than the F-14B when it comes to supersonic flight. The engines on the F-14A were really made to generate an immense amount of thrust at supersonic flight, while the F-14B generates an immense amount of thrust below supersonic. So the F-14A and F-14B are actually very different in the way they operate, which I find very cool, because when you look at the two aircraft, you actually don't really see any difference, but their design philosophy is actually very, very different from one another, even though they are both F-14 Tomcats. Something else you might have noticed and wondered upon was why the early Spitfire models were so bad at negative G flights. So even if you just rotate the aircraft 180 degrees, as you can see bottom left corner of the screen, engine died, float carburetor failure. These engines had a float carburetor, which meant they used the gravity of the Earth to actually operate the engine. Which means if you invert the gravity or create negative G's, such as right now, the carburetor will fail and it will flood the engine with fuel, which won't be able to run anymore. And it's actually a real issue that was plaguing the early Spitfire models, well, more like the early Spitfire engines models. And this issue was actually quite a problem when you want to, you know, perform actual dogfights. A little bit of negative G's and you lose engine power are actually very annoying in a dogfight. And it was especially bad considering that the German pilots, which had planes with engines that were powered by direct injection, were aware of this issue. So when they saw a Spitfire on their 6, all the German pilots would need to do to lose the Spitfire would be to push on the stick. For the Spitfire behind, to follow the Spitfire doing a negative G maneuver, they would first need to do a 180-degree turn, then pull on the stick so they would keep some positive G maneuvers while following the Messerschmitt. Not ideal, clearly needed a fix. The solution was very simple. At least a solution was found that was very simple. It was called the Miss Schilling's orifice, and it consisted in a little flow restrictor inside the carburetor intake, which allows the carburetor to not flood the supercharger once the carburetor would fail during a negative G maneuver. It was actually a pretty simple fix that worked somewhat well before an actual Rolls-Royce engine with direct injection could be put into service. On that note, I hope you enjoyed the video and see you guys around.